In 1950, Detroit was the fourth biggest city in the United States, bigger than Los Angeles, bigger than Boston. Today, it holds the record for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. No war reached this city, no plague, no hurricane, no earthquake, no single catastrophe. And yet nearly 2 out of every 3 people who once lived here are gone. Ask most people why Detroit collapsed and you will get one answer: the riot of 1967. Burn it down, they say, and the city never came back. That story is clean, it is dramatic, and it is wrong, or at least badly incomplete. The real answer started almost 20 years earlier, quietly, in a place nobody was watching. This is the case file on how a great American city disappeared in slow motion. To understand what Detroit lost, you have to see what it had. In 1950, the city held 1.85 million people packed into 139 square miles. Only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia were bigger. Detroit was not a sleepy factory town. It was a top 5 American metropolis, and it had gotten there in one generation. During World War II, Detroit's factories turned out tanks, bombers, and engines so fast that the city earned a nickname: the Arsenal of Democracy. After the war, that same machine kept running, just pointed at a different target. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, the Big Three, ran the largest concentration of auto manufacturing on Earth, and Detroit was their home base. At its peak, roughly 220,000 people worked in auto manufacturing jobs inside the city limits alone. These were not just jobs. They were tickets to the middle class for workers with no college degree, many of them black families who had come north during the Great Migration, looking for exactly this kind of work. The city built monuments to match its confidence. Michigan Central Station opened in 1913, designed by the same architects who built Grand Central Terminal in New York. 18 stories of Beaux-Arts stone, meant to be the gateway to a city that thought it was just getting started. A few miles away stood the Packard plant, designed by architect Albert Kahn and finished in 1911, one of the most advanced factories on the planet in its day. Both buildings were built to say one thing: Detroit is permanent. Neither one would stay that way. Here is the part most explainers skip. People did not leave Detroit because they suddenly hated it. They left because the work left first. And the jobs did not vanish into thin air. They moved, deliberately, one plant at a time, to places just outside the city line. Between 1947 and 1958, the Big Three built 25 new plants in the Detroit metro area. Every single one of them went up in the suburbs, not the city. Companies wanted cheap, open land for sprawling single-story factories, and city land was expensive, built up, and taxed. The scale of this shift is easy to miss if you only look at national numbers. Auto employment across the whole United States dropped only about 4.7% in this stretch. But inside Michigan, auto jobs fell by roughly 60%. That gap is the whole story. The industry did not shrink, it relocated, and it left Detroit specifically holding the loss. Historian Thomas Sugrue tracked the damage year by year. Between 1948 and 1967, Detroit lost an estimated 130,000 manufacturing jobs. Read that again, 1967. That is the year of the riot everyone blames. The jobs were already gone, most of them, before a single building burned that summer. Why did the suburbs win the jobs? Cheaper land, lower taxes, and, for some companies, distance from a unionized, increasingly black workforce they did not want to keep hiring. It was not one motive. It was several, stacked on top of each other, and all of them pointed the same direction, away from the city. The jobs moving out was only half the story. The other half is that the federal government built the roads and the rules that made leaving easy for some people and impossible for others. In 1956, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, funding the interstate system that connected new suburbs to old city jobs, and made commuting from far away practical for the first time. At the same time, the GI Bill offered low-interest, low-down payment mortgages to veterans, but almost entirely for new suburban homes. and in practice, mostly to white veterans. Black veterans faced discrimination from lenders and builders that kept most of them out of these new neighborhoods entirely. Underneath all of it sat an older policy: redlining. In the 1930s, a federal agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation drew maps of American cities and color-coded neighborhoods by risk. Almost any neighborhood with black residents was marked in red and labeled hazardous, which meant banks would not approve mortgages or home improvement loans there for decades afterward. The combined effect was a one-way door. Roughly 500,000 white residents left Detroit for the suburbs between 1950 and 1960 alone, taking their tax dollars and their spending with them, while redlining and lending discrimination kept most black families locked inside the city, unable to follow the jobs even if they wanted to. The highways did not just connect the suburbs, they also tore through the city itself. Interstate 75 and Interstate 375 were routed straight through Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, two of Detroit's most vibrant black neighborhoods, full of black-owned businesses, jazz clubs, and churches. Bulldozers leveled entire blocks to build the roads that carried suburban commuters past, not through, the communities they destroyed. So where does the 1967 riot fit? It was real, it was violent, and it mattered. 5 days of unrest left an official death toll of 43, though a later University of Michigan Dearborn recount argued the true number may have been as high as 47. But the riot was a spark hitting a pile of fuel that had been stacking up for 2 decades. It sped up an exodus that was already well underway. It did not start the fire. Once the pattern started, it fed itself. Fewer residents and businesses meant a smaller tax base. A smaller tax base meant the city had to raise tax rates on whoever was left just to keep paying for police, schools, and roads built for 2 million people. Higher rates on fewer people pushed the next wave out the door, and the cycle repeated for decades. The damage shows up starkly in one number. More than 160,000 Wayne County properties have gone through foreclosure since 2002. Whole blocks changing hands or simply emptying out. Entire streets in Detroit became rows of vacant lots, abandoned houses, and burned-out shells. Physical proof of a tax base that had been draining for half a century. On July 18, 2013, the city made it official. Detroit filed for Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, the largest municipal bankruptcy filing in United States history. Estimates of the total debt load range from an estimated $18 to $20 billion, a figure that included unpaid bonds, unfunded pension obligations, and retiree health care promises the city had made across decades but could no longer keep. Corruption made the wound worse, even if it was not the original cause. Former Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick was convicted on federal corruption charges and eventually sentenced to 28 years in prison for schemes that drained city contracts and resources during a period when Detroit could least afford it. He did not create the collapse. He broke what little public trust remained while it was already happening. The bankruptcy did not end in total loss. In 2014, a deal called the Grand Bargain brought together foundations, the state of Michigan, and other donors to contribute roughly $816 million. That money did two things at once. It protected the Detroit Institute of Arts from having to sell off its collection, and it softened the pension cuts facing retired city workers. Strip away the riot, the highways, and the bankruptcy filing, and one pattern sits underneath all of it. Detroit let itself become a one-industry city. When that industry was booming, that was fine. Great, even. But nobody built a plan for what happens when the industry decides it does not need to stay in one place anymore. That decentralization did not happen in a single bad year. It played out over roughly 20 years, from the late 1940s through the late 1960s, one plant closing at a time, one neighborhood hollowing out at a time. By the time most people were calling it a crisis, the core damage was already locked in. The riot, the highways, and the bankruptcy were downstream events. The upstream event was 2 decades of a company town quietly becoming a company suburb. The lesson is not, don't build a great industry. Detroit's auto boom built the American middle class. The lesson is that single industry towns need to diversify their tax base before the peak, not after the decline starts showing up in the numbers. By the time a collapse is obvious enough to name, it is usually too late to reverse. It can only be managed. In June 2024, Michigan Central Station reopened. Ford Motor Company spent roughly $950 million restoring the building that had stood gutted and graffitied for 3 decades, turning it into a hub for mobility and technology research. Drone footage of the lit-up station made headlines everywhere as a symbol of Detroit's comeback. But a rebuilt building is not a rebuilt city. In 2024, Detroit's poverty rate reached an estimated 34.5%, the highest it had been since 2017, with child poverty estimated around 51%. The city's population has shown a small uptick in recent Census Bureau estimates, the first gain in decades, though that figure is still an estimate, not a settled final count. A rebuilt skyline is not the same thing as a rebuilt city, and Detroit's next test may already be arriving. As the auto industry shifts toward electric vehicles, entire supply chains, from engine parts to transmission plants, are being reorganized again. Some economists have started asking whether a badly managed EV transition could carve out a new Rust Belt in Michigan and beyond, the same way gasoline-era decentralization did 70 years ago. Detroit did not fall in a single riot, a single mayor, or a single bad decade. It fell because a city let itself depend on one industry and let that industry quietly leave for 20 years before anyone treated it like an emergency. That is the pattern. It has repeated before, and it can repeat again. If you want to see how it played out somewhere else, the next case file is already open. Subscribe to Collapse Files, and